is going to talk about immigration, a history of immigration, or more importantly, the current national legislative proposal in mind, and in particular the proposal that has been introduced by the 8 senators. And I know that that's an 800-page gorilla, and everyone is still reading it at this time. It is entitled the Border Security, Economic Opportunity, and Immigration Modernization Act. But first, just a little introduction about Christian, because we already heard him in the panel before as to some of his credentials. But Christian, I believe you started early as a teenager when you volunteered for the St. Mary's Church locally, where you reside, back in the early 1990s, and you took that activism to Rutgers, where you were community chair of the Rutgers University Puerto Rican Student Union, and also you eventually were elected to the co-chair of the Latino Student Council, and then you went on from there to be a community organizer outside of Rutgers, but not too far, still in New Brunswick, working on civil rights matters and helping to develop the People's School of English, which offered free English classes to the working class. So you have gone on from there, and you received your degree in Rutgers, and you are now chair, vice president of the Latino Network. So it has been a long activist and community involvement road for you. So it is with great pleasure that I introduce you here to our community today, and we will share from you your thoughts on this important legislation.
Thank you. Well, thank you for having me. I'm very happy to be here talking to you. You know, one of the things I always like to share is that I'm the son of immigrants from the Dominican Republic. My parents immigrated here, or my parents' family immigrated here beginning in 1959. And this was during the time of a very brutal dictator in the Dominican Republic, Rafael Trujillo. And my grandfather left the island, you know, basically fleeing political persecution on the island. Landed in Puerto Rico first, spent about a year there, and then came to New York, and from New York to New Jersey. And my father followed. Then I went back, married my mother, brought her over. As a matter of fact, my oldest brother was born there, and in the place where he was born, this was after the dictator was assassinated. Basically, the people elected probably elected a very progressive president there, and some folks didn't like that, so they took this guy out. A civil war ensued, and in '65, in the year my brother was born, it was in the middle of a civil war that was happening there. And about a week after he went home from the hospital was bombed. It was destroyed. So they came right back here, and my brother had no memory of living there because he was only months old when he came here, and the rest of us were born here. Older ones in New York, and then my sister and I in Plainfield, New Jersey. And I'm telling you all that not just to tell you about me, but I want to tell you about the story of a lot of immigrants, right? If you hear some people tell it, they make it seem like somebody just woke up one morning in their home country and decided that they wanted to go to America and take advantage of the system and and they got up and they came here. And I don't know if anybody ever been to the Dominican Republic. You've been there? Anybody heard of the Dominican Republic?
Sure.
Okay. So those who have been there know it's a beautiful place. It's a paradise, right? There's a lot of poverty and everything, but it's beautiful. I don't think anybody wakes up and says, I want to leave this paradise, and I want to go to this cold place where I'm going to live in a small apartment, working in a factory, nobody wakes up and does that unless there's something compelling that gets them to move, right? And so, the story of my family is is similar to, you know, immigrants throughout history. Before Latino immigration, you know, the Irish left for a reason, right? The Italians left for a reason. The Polish left for a reason. Everybody left in big waves for a reason. And you might find some individuals say, no, 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 I wasn't part of that wave, I had this and that. But for the most part, you know, we can put a time in history when the big wave from every country in the world had their massive migration to the United States, right? We know when it is. We know where they went because they set up their enclave, right? And people say now, oh, these new immigrants, they don't want to integrate. They have their own, you know, they take over a town and all the stores become like them, and we weren't like that. And I go, well, how do you have Little Italy, you know, and how do you have, you know, the Polish American House in South Plainfield, and how do you have these different institutions and communities, right, that have the flavor of the immigrants of the time? And, you know, it's all the same. History repeats itself, right? And so, you know, I teach a class at Rutgers called Latino Workers in the U.S. And I spend the entire first month going over, you know, kind of case studies of different countries and their experience with migration. And I say migration, not immigration, because it's not always immigration, right? Because a lot of people don't realize that Puerto Ricans weren't immigrants, they were migrants, because at the time of the massive migration, Puerto Rico was already part of the U.S. They were already citizens, right? So, but they still experienced this movement of people into a place that was foreign to them, with a language that was not that known to them, where they faced pushback from the people who were already there, right? So the migrant experience was felt. And so what happens is, you know, a lot of people think that, well, you know, why would the Latino electorate, which is still majority, you know, a lot of them are Puerto Rican, especially in this area, care about immigration issues? Well, the reason is because Puerto Ricans experience the same type of conditions, even though they were U.S. citizens. You know, so it's not just about immigration status. It's how the immigrant or how the migrant is treated when they arrive somewhere, right? So, you know, we have the issue of immigration reform, or what we're going to do with 11 million undocumented people, and how we're going to normalize their status so they can come out of the shadows. That's important, right? But also, just as important is, once you do that, how do you integrate all those people, not just the undocumented ones, but the documented ones who've been here and have still been in the shadows to a certain extent? How do we take those people and integrate them into the fabric of our communities here? And how do you show them that they're not, you know, the other, they're part of us, because we're all diverse. And if we look back, you know, whether I'm first generation American, if we're second, third, fourth, you know, I don't know, and I have yet to come across somebody who can actually claim that their people were always here.
The original.
Because even the Mayflower people, they were immigrants. They showed up on these shores without papers. They did not have permission from the people here to come here, right?
That's right.
Right.
So
Native Americans.
they were illegal immigrants. Okay, they were the first illegal immigrants. But you know, but even the Native Americans, they were migrants, right? Because they, you know, thousands of years before migrated across the Bering Straits and all that. So, you know, the history of humanity is migration, right? As is all of nature. Nature moves. Everything in nature moves. So when we look at it that way, you know, and when we understand the stories of the people, right, we have a better idea of what's happening, what's going on. You know, right now there's a debate over the legislation for immigration reform. There's the Gang of Eight coming up with the law, which you just said the name of it. I can never get the name straight because these laws are. You have to read it. You can't remember it, right? And I could very easily do a discussion here where I go through every single law and what was in each one of them, you know. And I'll tell you, that's not even the important piece. People, you know, right now some people are complaining about the new law and saying, well, we did this in '86 and look what happened, right? We gave amnesty to 3 million people. We gave a path to citizenship for all these people, and look what happened, right? And we have to clarify that, right? That in '86 they were, you know, when they came up with the law, they were dealing with the people that were already here, the same way that we're dealing with the people that are already here. And that law fit that situation because there were roughly 3 million undocumented, and you had to figure out a way to do that. And it wasn't that law, anything was wrong with that law. What was wrong was that a few years later, right, they passed another big law that kind of just swept over on top of this, and that was NAFTA, right? So in 92, 93, they pushed through NAFTA, which completely reorganizes trade and the economies of Canada, the United States, and Mexico, and especially Mexico, right? And they knew that this new trade agreement was going to have a massive impact on the movement of goods, the movement of money, even the movement of executives. They actually put in provisions in NAFTA to make it easy for corporate executives to go back and forth between Mexico and the United States, right? And there were plenty of activists, plenty of people saying to them, you also have to put stuff in there for the movement of labor. Because when you make this kind of a massive restructuring of economies, there's going to be disruption in where people work. And they knew this was going to happen, and they refused to put in any provisions for the movement of workers, of working class people, of the 99%, right? And so what happened was that NAFTA had a lot of impact, but one of the easiest to explain and the one that had the biggest impact was corn. Corn. It's that simple, right? When they came up with the trade agreement about corn, it created an imbalance where it made the corn in the United States cheaper than the corn in Mexico. And you had these massive parts of Mexico, the state of Oaxaca, the state of Puebla, which is all big farming area, where their main thing that they grew there was corn. And the vast majority of the people who lived there worked on these massive farms. They were farm workers, not farm owners, not farmers the way we think of it, the guy with the coveralls and straw hat, he's riding his tractor, he's the man of the farm, and with a few, this is agro industry. This is huge farms, and millions of people worked on it, and millions of people worked there, and then they lived in towns, and those people worked on those farms, bought stuff and used services in those towns, and that created jobs, and it has a ripple effect. We understand what that's like, because we knew that we used to have huge car manufacturing factories. We had huge manufacturing spots in the United States, and when those jobs went away, right, entire regions died. We have in this country what's called the Rust Belt. It's called the Rust Belt because when the factories shut down, the whole towns died, right? And guess what happened to those people? They migrated. They left their states and they moved to other states and they looked for work other places, doing other things. So what happened in Mexico was, in 86, you already had a number of people here undocumented, all that, and that was a part of a longer, issue. But bringing it up to more up to date is you had, you finally kind of normalized everything, and then they went and disrupted everything again. And it took a few years for the impact to be felt, but when people left the farm, at first they didn't come here. At first they tried to go into the cities in Mexico, right? And when they got to the cities, they found that there weren't any jobs there. Or and people felt like they couldn't stay in the city. So some people who were already in the city said, you know what, there's too many people coming here, there's not enough jobs, I gotta go. And they got up and they started making the trip over here. And at first they started going into places along the border where people are used to seeing immigrants from Mexico. So Texas, Arizona, those places. But eventually, the disruption of this industry was so big that so many people came over that movement into the southern border states, right, created a saturation there, where even the immigrants themselves were like, don't go there. There's not enough jobs for all of us. So they started spreading out throughout the United States. And by the 90s, by the late 90s, we started seeing people, a growth of a Mexican community in New Brunswick, right? So you go down on French Street in New Brunswick, and that's like a little Mexico, right? And all the stores are from Oaxaca or Puebla. And there's like, and you can, there's two cuisines. There's Oaxaca food and there's Puebla food. And And everybody you meet, the first question, I'm Mexican. You're from Puebla or Oaxaca? Because you're going to be from one of those two places, right? Now, it doesn't mean that Mexicans are the only ones, because you had this disruption also had ripple effects all over, all over Latin America, and you still had residual immigration from some of the other disruptions, right? Because our country has a long history of intervening militarily in other countries, and once certain immigration flows start from places, right, they don't just turn off just like that. So, people who came from El Salvador in the 70s and 80s, right, there was a big flow then, and a lot of people were, their status was fixed in 86 or with temporary status stuff, but the flow continues because the disruption that happened in places like El Salvador, through the wars and everything, the rebuilding never quite happened, so there aren't any opportunities. So people continue to flow in. But when you look at the vast majority of the current undocumented and the newest immigrants, tend to be from Mexico and the very closely surrounding areas. When we understand that those people left because they left their country because of things that we did here, right? It seems kind of hypocritical that we make them the criminal. And we blew up your economy, we killed your jobs, and by the way, we let you get here, we let you work for us, for very cheap and under bad conditions, and now we call you the bad guy because you want to become a part of America, get your status straight, you want to become a citizen, you want to participate in the American way, and we say that's a bad thing, right? So, I think that the interesting thing, though, is that over these years, while a lot of people were living in the shadows, their children were growing up. Some of the children they brought with them as babies were growing up. And these kids America's their home. They might have been born somewhere else, but they were brought. My brother, right? My brother was born in the Dominican Republic, but he was here already before he turned 1 year old. He's American, and he didn't come here undocumented. So when he turned 18, the first thing he did was become a naturalized citizen, right? And he's as American as it gets. He's so American that I think he's a closet Republican. And then there's the younger siblings that were born here, right? And those kids they're now turning every year. I think it's like 50,000 children of immigrants are turning 18 nationally. So it's this huge pool of new voters coming in who were born here, don't have to get naturalized, and they know how their parents were treated. They know how their family struggled because they lived in mixed households where at least one parent might be undocumented, and they live in fear that one night someone may come banging the door and drag their mother or father away, and it's real. I mean, this is not Hollywood. I have people in my own family. My brother-in-law, a couple years back, they showed up at midnight and they dragged him off, and it took us a month to find out even where he was, in which detention center he was. And they initially took him to Elizabeth, but within a few days, he was off in a different state. They move him like that, right? And it takes a long time to find out where they are. And this is the kind of stuff that, you would think would only happen in, some totalitarian state from a long time ago. But this is kind of like, conditions that these families live under of total fear. And I know because of my experience, not just as an activist, but as someone who has, in our family, have mixed status families within my family, and in our circle of friends and through my church, right, that I've often gotten those phone calls in the middle of the night that, immigration just showed up. ICE just came, and they just took such and such, and can you help us find them? Yes.
It's interesting when you talked about the legislation, but the fact of the matter, as I see it, corporate America and farm owners who want cheap migrant workers. There hasn't been one employer who's gone to jail for knowingly hiring illegal immigrants. The fact of the matter is we have a whole economy based on cheap labor, and that's exactly what corporate America wants. That's what the big farm owners want. They created a situation where there is a need for labor. These workers came into this country. We could have stopped it. We don't need electrified fences at millions of dollars a foot. We don't need any of that to patrol the border. All you had to do was to put some employers in jail for knowingly hiring. But they never went to jail because, in fact, they wanted these workers. They're now in this country, and they don't want to legalize them and as path to citizenship for two reasons. Number one, if they are citizens, they can't be abused financially. They come under safety laws and fair working conditions. They would rather have immigrant workers who are undocumented that they can exploit, live in fear, keep their wages depressed, and that is the shocking crime. And you have to hold accountable not only the employers, but the fact of the matter is legislators in Washington, who knowingly for years have allowed a whole pool, a whole second tier of workers in this country to be systematically exploited and doing nothing about it, and then punishing them by dividing their families, making them live in fear. Now, I have a real problem with that. With the legislation, there were laws that said you're not to hire illegals. But there was never any enforcement of that on the employer side. In Arizona, there is only one case where somebody who hired an illegal worker has even been fined. Well, where are all these people working? Who are they working for? Yet no employer has ever been jailed, and then the fines are so pathetic that it's worth paying the fine because of the money you're making, the profit over the cheap labor.
But the question is this: what it comes back down to is you know, is it the fault of the immigrant?
No.
Right, that they're here. You know, is it wrong for them to come here? And why are we not welcoming them more? And I think you hit it right in the
We're
head.
encouraging that.
Well, I think that what it comes down to is that, you know, even looking at the position of saying, well, let's find the employers because that'll keep people away. Why are we trying to keep them away? Honestly, the reality is that without the immigrants, right, without new immigrants, our population would be shrinking. And a shrinking population is bad for an economy. Okay, look at some of those countries in Europe that have aging populations that are not replacing their own population. They're in trouble, right?
But if you have a need, you have an obligation to pay them a fair wage and not exploit them. And our union movement in this country is based on that.
Don't you think, though, that there should be a legal immigration process?
Yes.
I mean, there's a backlog of legal immigrations from non-Latino countries that are trying to get status the regular way, you know, through. But
that's the fault of lawmakers who have kept the quota system artificially low. In other words, they know what the real flow is, right, or what the real demand is for entry, and they've known for a long time, and they keep the numbers artificially low. And so any immigration laws have to reflect the reality of the need for people to come in. And when I say the need, it's not the need of the immigrants, it's the need on both sides, right? It's the need of the economy. And so if you have honest lawmaking where you have the quotas, the right numbers, or closer to the real need, then there shouldn't be backlogs, and people wouldn't have to feel that they need to circumvent the system. Because the reality is that, you know, everybody thinks that everybody who's here undocumented, you know, crossed the border along Mexico. You know, that's not what happened. A majority of them came here with some sort of visa, some sort of papers, and then overstayed. And that includes non-Latino immigrants. Because let me tell you something, I come into contact with a lot of Irish immigrants who did not cross the Mexican border. They flew in here and they showed up at Newark Airport with papers. And then they overstayed their visa.
That's right.
Okay? And so, you
A
know.
lot of them are au pairs, and there's a lot of
Yeah.
workers from Poland who
In the healthcare
and they're
industry.
brought over by
Yep.
not only a corporate employer, but a private employer.
That's
It's
right.
Totally under, you know, in the shadows.
Yeah. So there's a lot of
Yeah, a couple of things on that. One of them is that we are, historically, when it comes to legislation, and immigration reform is not excluded from that, we tend to be great reformers of past problems and not look at future issues. For example, even this immigration reform covers illegals who were here prior to December 31st, 2011.
Right, it's leaving out a whole
Do
year.
we think that the illegal immigration is going to stop after 2011? What are we going to do for them?
There are
We're already
500,000
building in
2000.
the next problem. And this is right off the bat.
And I'm gonna say something, and this kind of, you know, circles back to what we were talking about in the earlier segment about organizing, right?
Mhm.
And we often ask, how come, you know, how come Latinos don't participate more with us? How come different, you know, groups don't participate more with us, right? How come some of these meetings are not as diverse as we're fighting for their rights, right? Well, I think we need to look at our own language, right? Because we've been referring to them as illegals, right? And that's really like the anti-immigrant way of talking about them. It's undocumented. Because the reality is that even if you did something illegal, it doesn't make you an illegal, right? Because if you run a red light, right, you did something illegal, but nobody labels you now as an illegal driver,
That's right.
right?
That's right.
You're not an illegal driver.
And our society
That's very good.
tends to name
Yeah.
and utilize those names, and it's at times that we need to call that out.
And we as progressives have to start with us. So I would hope that the rest of this conversation, that we don't refer to them as illegals, that they're undocumented, right?
What I find interesting, though, that there's no interest in putting a fence in the northern border.
No.
I mean, you know how much billions of dollars, to build that fence, which, by the way, is not going to keep people out if they want to really get across the border, is costing millions and millions of dollars to build this fence. Yet we have the longest border in the north. You think that undocumented people are not coming through Canada?
I think part of the
Of course
problem.
they are.
I think part of the problem with that is the Canadians speak English.
Well, then
Yeah,
there's
And-
a bias
and-
there.
There's
like
a
the
bias
guy,
there.
and like the guy who won the lottery,
Yeah.
he'd been in the country for 18 years, had to have a translator because he still didn't know how to speak English.
Right.
I think you know,
That's
that,
an issue right
that's
there.
an issue
Now,
there.
why is that an issue? Why is it an issue?
Most
Well, I mean,
immigrants
I'll give you
coming
from my
first generation.
perspective.
But let me ask,
Because
why is it an issue?
Because English is our language.
Well,
Most
no,
of,
and when the Irish came, they learned English. When the Polish came, they learned English. When the Italians came, they
I'm
learned English.
gonna beg to differ with you, and I know I'm your guest, and I'm sorry that I might be disagreeing with some of you, but I'm gonna beg to differ with that, okay? You know, everybody says that, right? But I know so many Italian friends of mine who have Italian grandmothers who never learned English,
Right.
who can
Exactly.
hardly
First
speak English.
generation.
I know so many friends of mine, Polish American friends, who have Polish grandmothers who don't know English.
Their children
And it's the children learn English. So the people who actually immigrate here tend not to, especially if they move into enclaves where they're around people like them and they don't need to. And to say that these particular immigrants are doing it different than anybody before them is not really knowing the truth. The truth is that every group has ever come in history. You go to Chicago, okay, German, okay, they had German clubs where they spoke German because the first generation didn't know English. And when they went to work in the meat packing houses, right, you needed a foreman who was bilingual, who spoke German and English, because somebody had to tell the German workers how to do their work. And that was 20, 30 years into them being here, right? So the truth of history tells us that he's not doing anything different than anybody else. And by the way, would it be better for him if he had learned English? Maybe so, right? But then we have a problem is that this country says that we want them to learn English, right? But we constantly cut funding and resources to programs that teach them English. And then we say to him, you sir, who you own the bodega, right? You own the store, right?
Mm-hmm.
Has anybody here ever owned a store or owned a small business? Okay, you own a small business. How many hours a day do you work on your small business?
A lot.
27, 28 hours a day? Is that really happening?
No time for night
There is
school,
no time for night school, and when you run a retail store, you open it up before the sun comes up and you close it down after everybody else is sleeping. So going to class to learn a language that isn't necessarily going to change your bottom line, because in the neighborhood that you run your store, the customers, you don't need it, because he probably knew enough English to tell somebody $1 for this. Right, and he was doing, and he's hardworking. He's hardworking, law-abiding, does everything else right, and I don't think he should be penalized for the fact that he didn't stop working hard to go learn the language.
Let me from an experience. I mean, my grandparents emigrated. They didn't speak any English, but they learned. They spoke both languages, but they learned. They also worked. You know, coming over from Europe through Ellis Island. You know. Martinez they also worked, you know, and back in New York City in the days, it wasn't the best working conditions in the, you know, early 1900s. And they, you know, they were working 12 hours a day, and I think, you know, if you ask them, they said, you know, we learned the language, you know, we came here, we didn't know any English, you know, they worked like crazy, but they learned. They knew both languages, so sometimes in the family circle, in those group circles, they'll speak the native language, whether it's Yiddish or Russian or whatever. But then they also, you know, made it their business. They were here to learn the language of the, you know, there is no national language.
You know, I think there's two things here. One is saying, yeah, if they want to learn, fine. That's totally up to them. Their prerogative to go ahead and do it. But if they don't, we shouldn't. We shouldn't categorize that as being a negative.
But
you know, so I think we're all saying the same thing.
Their children
difference is
The
they have a
reality
desire.
is, the second generation, or the first generation always
But-
learns
but
English,
you know-
because they go to school in the United States.
But can we say this? Look, you said, we talk about desire, not desire. One of the things, the way you introduced me is that we had the People's, you know, School of English, right? When I was, you know, 20 years old at Rutgers University, you know, we decided we wanted to get off of campus and start organizing in the community. And we were, you know, lefty kids, and we were like, we're going to start a revolution and all that stuff. And we went into New Brunswick, and we started knocking on doors, and we started asking, you know, the Latino community there, what do you want? You want us to, like, you know, protest for, you know, for healthcare? You want us to protest for jobs? What do you want? And they said, man, we just want to learn English. And it's hard for us because we work hard. We don't have a lot of time. We have little children. We have a lot of issues, right? And we can't afford it because there are no free programs, and the ones that cost money are, you know, we can barely feed ourselves. Right? So we said, all right, we went to Mount Carmel Church in New Brunswick, and they have classrooms they use for their catechism classes, and we said, can we borrow your classrooms? And they said yes, and we have 5 classrooms and a bunch of volunteers from Rutgers, and we set up the free classes, and within a week we had 150 students and 150 people on the waiting list, right? So anybody tells me that people don't have the desire, I've never seen that in action, right? And so people want to do it, right? We need to facilitate that. I think that if you facilitate it, people want to do it. I have yet to meet somebody who doesn't speak English in this country that said, and you ask them, that they'll say, I refuse to learn. They don't refuse to learn. They either can't find the time, the money, or something's in the way, right? But the desire is always there. I think that but if we get stuck on this idea that without knowing for sure, and say because they don't speak English, they must not have the desire, we need to talk to them and engage with them, and we'll find out that if we talk to enough people, we'll find out why is it that you don't know English yet, and they'll tell you, and if we work together, we'll find ways that we can, you know.
I think you just hit the nail on the head, but let me rephrase my response to Sonia's question. Perception is reality. The perception is Latinos refuse to learn English. That's not true, because like what you just said is absolutely true.
That's right.
But the perception is,
yes,
and perception is
reality.
reality.
Perception is being actually played up. It's promoted in order to create divisiveness. So that
and this is not the first time that these perceptions have been played up, right? Because when you look back in history and you do when you look at every immigrant group that came before for the past couple hundred years, the newspapers have pictures of what you name the group. I'll tell you that they had a derogatory picture of them in the cartoons
No
in the
Irish
newspaper.
being
Oh, yeah.
No Irish being applied. They're
Yes.
garbage. They draw them as animals.
Exactly.
You name it, they've done it.
Thomas
Without-
Nast was absolutely
right?
in there.
Masked, exactly.
Yeah.
So the thing is that this is history repeating itself, and what gets me is that we actually perpetuate the same things over again, and we that are progressive, right? We say we're progressive, and then yet sometimes we fall into the same type of thing, and I think that we need to ask ourselves and say, we knew that this, you knew Nest, so you knew about that history,
Yes.
right? And maybe those, because of the right wing is doing such a good job of what they're trying to do, it's invading and putting a block between your memory of what Nast did to previous immigrants, right, and what they're doing to them now, right? And it's sad that that's actually succeeding, because I see really good people who I agree with on 99% of issues that still, on this issue, still use the language of oppression, and that's a problem,
It's interesting, a woman that I know made a point of telling me that her grandson had applied for a job in corporate America, but was declined because he couldn't speak Chinese. And I said, well, who got the job? Someone who was Chinese who could speak English. The fact is, we live in a country where we take the attitude learning many different languages is not a major goal. Where European schools, the Japanese schools, the Chinese schools, it is mandatory when they go to their schools to learn another language. They have to. It's not an option, and they start at a young age. And you know why? Because the Chinese and the Japanese know when you're going to compete internationally, if you know English, if you know Spanish, if you know French, that gives you an opportunity economically to succeed. Unfortunately, in our country, if you take Hillsborough for an example, we don't require a language till you get to high school, really. And when they do, they're starting it now in the elementary schools, where there's a smattering.
Yes.
But we are far behind other countries in the world in recognizing that language
Is important.
is essential to economic progress, personally and nationally. And a lot of the problems we're talking about learning English, if our schools mandate learning English and other foreign languages, it would benefit all the children in our society.
In this current global economy, which is only growing, learning just one language becomes a disability.
Right.
I have been to a lot of places in the world. Last year I was in Ukraine, in Kiev. In Kiev, in Ukraine, I'm in a restaurant. They give me a menu with Ukraine and underneath little words in English.
Oh.
When I ordered, I said, hot dog. The waitress says, how many would you like to have?
Exactly, exactly.
The waitress.
Yes.
This is a waitress who is bilingual.
Now, I have been in meetings with other other individuals from other countries. They with the Japanese in one situation. They understand when I speak English.
Absolutely.
The translator is then translating to Japanese. So the fellow that I'm negotiating with gets two bites at that apple.
Yes.
He gets to think about what I just said, and then with the translation. When the response comes back to me, I only get the 10 seconds.
Right.
You're right.
From there. It is a disability and a disadvantage
Absolutely.
not to train, not to educate our children with learning more than one language. We have someone from another country, an immigrant, that can speak that language. We should not discourage that from not to be spoken.
Right.
We should encourage that. We should make that person teach that language, so to speak. Take it one step further.
Well, one of the
Then they learn from us.
Well, one of the problems with, like, with this discussion not going in the right direction, when we talk about this, is that you know, the idea that they need to learn English, right? The next step of that conversation a lot of times ends up being, we need to get rid of bilingual education in these schools because these immigrants just need to learn English, right?
Right.
Well, guess what happens when that happens? So, and this is something, as a first generation Latino, first immigration from immigrant parents, I know it because I don't have an accent, right? I'm talking to you as same as what you are, right? I have more problems speaking and reading and writing in Spanish, right? And so what happens is, because I didn't go to bilingual education, I didn't do any of that stuff, English is my language, right? Even though my parents and grandparents spoke Spanish to me, right, I didn't learn it in school. So, you know, I was hearing words in my mind, you know, if somebody said it with a little slur, or they mispronounced the word, or I misheard what they said, I had a whole different vision of what that word was. It wasn't until high school when I took Spanish that I go, that's how you spell that? That's what, you know, that's how that word works, right? And so the children of the immigrants are becoming disconnected from their family's language, right? And that creates a lot of problems, actually. Because the parents are okay with their kids just learning English and just being able to communicate a little bit with their parents in Spanish. Because the parents also can talk a little bit of English too, and they get by, right? But what happens is when the kid is having trouble at school and can't communicate to the parent exactly what's going on, right? Then the problems, you know, they start to snowball, right? Because we know that even when you speak the same language as your child, you don't know what they're saying, right? You don't know what your teenager's going through, even when they speak the same language. Imagine a parent who's working 2 jobs, never quite had formal training in English, learned it from TV and from around there, and then their kid never really learned Spanish, right? And just knows a little few words. And then this teenager, this 13-year-old girl is going through a crisis in her life, but can't really talk to mom about it because they don't really speak the same language, right? Now, kids who went to bilingual education from early on, right, they learn both languages. That's why it's called bilingual. Another way to look at it is, forget about the word bilingual because it's toxic. Dual language, right? If you have an opportunity to have a child who is living in 2 worlds simultaneously, right? At home, they're living in a Spanish-speaking home, and at school, they're in, and everywhere else, they're in an English environment, right? At an early age, if you start teaching them their ABCs in both languages, and their basic, you know, in both languages, these kids are going to be what we're talking about.
Exactly.
They're dual language learners.
They can think in either
language. They can think in either language. They are going to be the people who, when they grow up, they can work in international. Exactly. And by the way, science tells us from studies, right, that once you learn one additional language, it becomes easy to learn more.
Especially the younger you are, you can pick it up very quickly.
And then you all of a sudden...
If I could just back that up with two interesting points. One is what he's saying. That is actually proven. There's a misnomer. People always like to say, if you put a baby with its foreign-speaking grandmother, it'll get confused. That's actually, the reverse is true. And my mother is an example of that. She's a first-generation immigrant. She spoke Spanish before she spoke English because of being exposed to her grandmother and even her parents. And she went on to become like a PhD in Spanish literature, taught. She learned French. I mean, she is like a linguist. And now in her 70s, she does translation in court, which is actually so it actually helps in the cognitive development. I mean, but the other point that you made, I think, is really interesting about the Chinese language. People who send their children to Montessori and very expensive nursery schools in this area and in Silicon Valley or in Los Angeles, they're competitive. I mean, it's like a huge competition to get into the Mandarin immersion or just to take Mandarin. So think about that a little. Like, what's that about? Why are we valuing? Of course, you could say it's the Chinese economy. But years ago, Spanish was considered, and I think that's still true, learning Spanish was considered very important to be able, in business. And so I think it's the same. So we should really examine that a little bit, what our assumptions are.
If I may interrupt, we have about 5 minutes
sure,
left.
That's the only thing.
And this is a wonderful topic, and we can talk about this forever. Let me just ask you one question, Chris, with regards to the new Immigration Reform Act. What do you think could be the hardest thing to get past Congress in this?
you mean the hardest,
Hurdle.
the hard part of the bill
Part
itself?
of the bill itself.
I mean, I think that there's been a lot of pushback regarding the path to citizenship. That's the biggest piece that the right has been pushing back on, is that path to citizenship. The activist community has been saying we want the shortest possible path, no more than 5 to 7 years, and then you have the other side says no path at all, right? So and basically we want this permanent underclass, right? And so what the Gang of 8 came out with was 12 years or 13 years. It was 10 years of you being here, and at the end of the 10 years, you get your green card, your permanent residency card, and then you're eligible to get your citizenship within three years. And even though the immigrant rights community doesn't like the idea of having it so long, I think that people are in general saying, well, it's something, and we need to push for it. Now, obviously, you have some legislators or some congressmen, trying to look for any excuse to get at even that, right? And they use
your mid-30s before you even.
Yeah, but I think that they're trying. We had the tragedy in Boston this week, and you already have a congressman come out and say, well, given that those guys are from another country, and it's like it has nothing to do with this conversation. There's no indication that these perpetrators were undocumented or had any kind of issues with immigration, and they're trying.
They were not undocumented.
They were not undocumented.
And one was a naturalized citizen.
Yeah. So they're trying to connect it to this as a way. Yeah. So they're trying to connect it to this as a way to try to say this is why I'm not voting for it. And I think that the challenge for us is to be able to talk to our Congress people and get them to understand the importance of this, not just to the immigrants themselves. I mean,
right.
I'm not an undocumented immigrant, but I'm very passionate about this, and we should all be passionate about this for all the reasons, right? And the reality is this: if you care about people learning English, right, incentivize it. Guess what? You have to know English to pass the citizenship test.
Oh yeah.
Right? So if you want more people to learn English, pass this bill. Get a path to citizenship. You will have people lining up and paying money and taking time off of work just to do it, because we know it. Because it's happened before. In the 80s, when you created the path to citizenship, people lined up for citizenship courses. They learned American history. They learned English. They did all of the above. We can do that again, and it's part of this law. So, but the interesting thing is, right? The people with probably the most influence over this process isn't me, right? Because I'm a Latino Democrat from Union County with a Democratic congressman who's already on board with this.
Right.
Rush Holt already supports this.
Oh yeah.
I just got to call him up and thank him and keep him on message, right? You guys have a Republican congressman, right, who hasn't committed to voting for this bill. And you have the opportunity, but you know what? We have to decide. If it's for gun laws, we'll call him and say, we want you to support, gun safety, right? We need you to call him and say, we need you to support this bill.
The problem is, and I think the answer to your question was the hardest part is talking to the congressman, because the U.S. Congress is a wholly owned subsidiary of corporate America.
But let me ask you this. You're here because you believe you can make a difference.
Yeah.
Right? You go knock on doors every election time because you believe that even if we're up against a brick wall, we're going to keep on going, right? You do everything that you can here. You will write a letter or pick up the phone to support the gun law, right? You need to do the same thing for this, and we need to say, I'm not making excuses, right? I'm going to put the same effort to this that I would for any other issue, and I don't care that my congressman is a Republican. I'm going to talk to, and I'm not just going to call myself. I'm going to go through the voter list, right? And I'm going to call up unaffiliated voters. They're not Democrats, not Republicans. And we know how to do it because we do it for election time, right? Because on election time, for Barack Obama, we didn't just call up Democratic voters. We called up Democrats and unaffiliated, right? For Barbara Bono, I sure hope we're not going to only call Democratic voters up. We're going to call everybody up, right? So for this issue, you can show your support for it by the people in this room, calling up Democrats and unaffiliated voters and asking them to call Congressman Lance and getting him to support this bill. And if this bill passes and Lance votes for it, right? I'll come back here and throw you guys a party and thank you for helping get him to support it.
Well, that's excellent.
Excellent.
Can have a party with everybody. Thank you very much, Chris. Thank you so much.